everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Maria Palambini. I am the Director of Communities and Initiatives Development with the Emerging Tech Team here at IEEE Standards Association. We have a really exciting 45-minute live thinking session featuring 3 experts with expertise in the global challenge of counterfeit medicine, blockchain technologies and how they work within the pharmaceutical framework, and the concerns and barriers to adopting technology within the pharmaceutical enterprise. Before we get started, I just want to give us a few housekeeping items. We've muted all the attendees so that we don't disturb any of the participants during the call. If you're experiencing any audio technical issues, please be sure to message the host. There's a little drop-down option in the chat box that allows you to send your questions to the host. Our web tech guru, David, is on the line with us, which you just heard him before, and he will answer your issues directly. We will be taking questions from the audience. Actually, at the end of each presenter's presentation, we will take 1 or 2 questions, and then we have allotted approximately 8 to 10 minutes at the close for all the questions that come through that we're not able to get through the process. So we definitely encourage you. We want you to join the conversation. We want you to ask questions. Our experts are ready in here to help you. So before we begin with the presentations, I am actually in the midst of offering an open letter to blockchain developers, essentially asking them to get a little bit of understanding of what's going on in the pharmaceutical enterprise and to express some of the concerns of pharmaceutical professionals and academic researchers in understanding how the blockchain application can fit into the pharmaceutical framework. So if you're interested in having your question posed, this is going to be an open letter that I will publish in different blockchain communities. I invite you to submit your question. It's optional. You don't have to do it, but I think it's a great opportunity to sort of get to the answer that you're looking for on the website noted on the slide, and I will publish it. All questions are anonymous, so it's not tied to you directly. It's just I will compile the list of questions and get it out there. So hopefully you guys will answer the challenge and participate. So now on to the experts. We have with us 3 really defining experts in the industry. You know, when you talk about pharmaceutical and blockchain, it doesn't seem like we can get to many experts, and I'm delighted to have these 3 join me today. First, we have Tim Mackey. He is the director of the Global Health Policy Institute, an assistant professor of anesthesiology in global public health at UC San Diego School of Medicine. His work focuses on an array of multidisciplinary topics in domestic and global public health. He has extensive professional experience. He has worked with the World Health Organization, with the Department of Justice, and many other national and international organizations. We also have with us Daryl Glover, who is the Chief Clinical Officer for iSolve. iSolve is a solutions company developing cutting-edge blockchain applications that provide security, visibility, and proof of access for companies throughout the drug development lifecycle. Daryl is a highly experienced international business professional with expertise in operations, marketing, finance, strategy, biz dev, recruiting, and mHealth. And finally, we have Mark Paxton, who is the CEO of R360, an international pharmaceutical supply chain consortium dedicated to patient safety by promoting practices to protect supply chains and distribution channels. Mark has a present background working as regulatory counsel for the CDR Office of Compliance for the FDA, and he's also worked with major international global initiatives such as Asia Pacific Economic Corporation and many other areas in international regulatory affairs at the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. And obviously, I'm your moderator today. So before I let Tim take it away with his first presentation, you all stepped up to the challenge we asked you, and you told us what you thought about patient safety and blockchain. And I'm not actually surprised by the results, but 57% of you told us that you're kind of unsure. And I think that's why approximately 100 of us are live on this call trying to find out if blockchain can rise to the challenge. So without further ado, I'd like to have Tim Mackey take it away.
Great. I think I just got unmuted. This is Tim again, and I want to thank all of you participants for joining us on this very interesting discussion that we'll have, very multidisciplinary, very multisectoral, about how blockchain can impact the global counterfeit medicines trade. Maria, could you go to the next slide? So I wanted to set up this conversation with providing some context of what we call to characterize this huge public health problem that we've been dealing with for decades. And it's one of the problems that I've actually been working on for the full extent of my academic career. And it's really a complex problem. So first, the trade in fake medicines, I'll call it fake medicines because counterfeit denotes a IP issue, is a problem that impacts all settings in the healthcare system, including all parts of the global drug supply chain. That can include, closed sections of the supply chain like hospitals, pharmacies, et cetera, large global health programs, and also unregulated settings where medicines are sold on the street or in night markets. In the webinar introduction, if you read it online, it said that WHO estimates that 10 to 30% of drugs in least developing countries are counterfeit, and that in developing countries it's about less than 1%. I can tell you those statistics are pretty much garbage. No one really knows the true scope and prevalence of counterfeits because it's very difficult to measure this type of criminal activity. But we do know it's a billion-dollar industry and that it impacts patients all over the world. And there's a number of documented cases, hundreds of cases of people dying from fake medicines because either they don't contain any active ingredient or they in fact contain toxic ingredients. So at the top of this slide, you can see some of the manufacturing that is done for fake medicines, and the fact that they look very close to the real thing, the packaging, makes them very difficult to detect. Another thing we know is that the global counterfeit medicines trade is operated by transnational criminal networks that are, frankly, they see a business opportunity to make money, especially when they want to diversify, their illicit drug market and go into prescription drugs. So we see explosive growth in this sector, and a number of international organizations, including the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, Interpol, and the WHO are working on this issue. Next slide, please. So again, I mentioned that we don't know the scope of the problem, but we do have some good data that indicates that this is a problem, not just for developing countries, but also high-income countries. A study that we did in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, actually, we got our hands on some data from the private sector, and we were able to collect information that they collect through their security apparatuses, and we analyzed this data to figure out what the global scope of fake medicines were in the closed supply chain. And what I mean by the closed supply chain is that's a place in the supply chain where you as a consumer should expect to receive legitimate products, so not in the informal economy or an unregulated setting. And what we found was from 2009 to 2011, there were over 1,500 incidents of counterfeit medicines penetrating the closed supply chain in over 69 different countries. So it's a large problem. Next slide, please. So another thing that, another piece that we published just recently looked at different types of digital technologies that are trying to address this problem. So Maria, this is an animated slide, so you can just go through it. You can just click through. So first we wanted to find out what type of technologies were being leveraged and what type of technologies have promise. So one of the technologies that we identified were mobile technologies, and something, this picture here shows a picture of M-Pedigree, where you essentially scratch off a barcode and then you text that number and then you're able to authenticate whether that medicine is real or not. And of course, next slide, or next advance, yeah. RFID technology, which a lot of you on this call will be aware of, to track and trace a medicine through the supply chain using radio frequency identification. Next, go ahead and advance. And then things that address the online pharmacy side, which is another problem specific to high-income markets where fake medicines are sold through illicit online pharmacies. Go ahead and advance. And these are just some images of some web seals that differentiate fake pharmacies from real pharmacies. Go ahead and advance. Advance again. And so another technology we found that kind of fits in the middle is advanced computational solutions, mostly machine learning. We won't be talking about that in this presentation, but ML also has a lot of applied components that can actually work within a blockchain as well. But one of the most important findings in this study was that blockchain technology was a technology that could potentially unify a lot of these different technology formats and create a shared data platform that could really advance anti-counterfeit activities. Go ahead, next slide. So we finally get into blockchain now, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of its application to this problem, and then Daryl will go into the more technical issues of it in relation to supply chain. But essentially, as all of you probably know on this call, a blockchain is a distributed, decentralized ledger, and what it has the potential to do is to increase the sharing of data that we need to really understand, the full scope of the fake medicines problem, and to share it in a way that's more trustworthy, accountable, and transparent. It also allows us to share data across multiple drug supply chain actors. And what we're really interested in is making sure that this information is immutable and it establishes a form of e-pedigree through documentation and cryptography. Beyond just the supply chain dynamics, it will also have the potential to provide us with enhanced counterfeit drug surveillance. Because what we do now is essentially we wait for a patient to get hurt, and then we go back and investigate it to try to find out what happened. So, for example, in 2012, the FDA detected fake versions of the anti-cancer drug Avastin, and it was actually, this is a very expensive cancer drug, and what was in these vials was essentially cornstarch and acetone. But we still don't know how many patients were impacted to this day, and the only reason why we really picked this up is because a nurse noticed foreign language markings on the packaging. So that's not a very proactive way to address a very important patient safety issue. So blockchain can help us create the data that we would need to proactively detect counterfeit risk characteristics and supply chain anomalies. And another thing it can do is act as a more robust post-market surveillance shared ledger, which is something that benefits patients not from just the fake medicines component, but from just a general patient safety issue. Go ahead and advance, Maria. And you can advance one more as well. So some of the other things that blockchain has the potential to do is to really integrate a lot of the anti-counterfeit solutions we just talked about. So our scoping review identified a lot of different technologies, including mobile, NFC, scanning devices, et cetera. And a blockchain could essentially create a space that could share a lot of this data or metadata, and again, provide us with more robust information about counterfeit prevalence and detection. Of course, it would enhance security of that information. It could also lead to better interoperability because our global supply chain crosses over multiple jurisdictions, and oftentimes we're not sharing data in the same way or under the same standards. We also think that blockchain as a somewhat agnostic technology could lead to regulatory harmonization, which is really important when understanding, the scope of the problem. So, for example, we don't even have a very good definition of what is a fake medicine, and this technology and the collection of that data could help us, remedy those situations. And then most importantly, something that Mark will also talk about in his slide is, most of the time you have a very innovative technology, and it takes years and years to get the legislation or the policy rationale to actually get this technology implemented. But in this case, we actually have some very robust drug safety legislation and policy frameworks that we can leverage to argue to, essentially implement blockchain as a solution. So one of them is the federal requirement in the U.S. to require a national track and trace system under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, which Mark will talk about. But even in Europe, there are things like the Falsified Medicines Directive and the Metacrime Convention, which create a space to have this discussion about what technology is needed to combat fake medicines. And blockchain is going to be one of those critical components. I'll go ahead and advance. So I'll end there. I'll just note that we're having an exciting event that Maria will talk about in June at Johns Hopkins University, really focusing on the application of blockchain, the practical application of blockchain for a number of drugs supply chain supply issues. So that's where we're going to really tease out a lot of, kind of the dynamics and the mechanisms of how this would work. And of course, I look forward to a robust discussion in the Q&A. So thank you. Maria, I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you, Tim, for setting the scene on the conversation. This is a great presentation to give us sort of a landscape of what we like to call a global health crisis with counterfeit medicine. Before I move on to Daryl's presentation, I just had a quick question for you. We've seen various things with regards to patients or advocates calling for, to verify the drugs on the blockchain, making it public on a distributed ledger. And naturally, the manufacturers and the stakeholders on the chain have a little bit of concern of privacy. So my question to you is in its simplest form, if we were to put the source of the drugs, make it available on a public distributed ledger, would the privacy of the manufacturer be sacrificed in exchange for patients having able to verify that data?
Okay, good. Yeah, absolutely. So Maria, first, you bring up a really dynamic and interesting question that has a long answer, so I'll make it short as possible, but really tying into two issues. One is data privacy when it comes to the consumer perspective or the patient perspective, which could impact things like HIPAA and whether the information constitutes PHI, which it would most likely would. And then also the issue of confidentiality of supply chain information. So the idea of opening up a blockchain or public blockchain and having it go all the way down to the patient level is something I don't think we're at the point of really having a discussion about. I think what is more pragmatic at this point is to have closed blockchains or private blockchains that really focus on specific supply chain areas of vulnerability or even specific therapeutic products. When we get to the point where we're able to do what would be pedigree that goes all the way from, the API or the active pharmaceutical ingredient all the way to the end user, that may be the best solution, in the long run. But in the short term, we really need to establish more viable use cases that really pinpoint areas of the supply chain that are the weakest. In the future, of course, as you mentioned, I think anonymizing the data or aggregation of the data could alleviate some of these privacy and also confidentiality issues.
Excellent. So good. We're starting to get quite a few questions, and I want to move on, obviously, to Daryl Glover, who's going to give us the tech view on blockchain. iSolve is one of the few companies that exclusively look at blockchain application within the pharmaceutical supply chain, and they bring a very interesting perspective and a lot of insight and experience on the work that they're doing. So, Daryl?
Okay. Thank you, Maria. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Okay, so when we think about the application of blockchain technology, as Tim was discussing, to the supply chain or to other things like clinical trials, regulatory submissions, we really look at it as a bridging technology to communicate, interconnecting those systems that don't really speak well to each other, whether they're between trusted participants in a supply chain, for example, or even within an organization itself. Often they'll be running different versions of SAP or Oracle, and there's not a good way to track that data. And we really see the blockchain as this complement to the existing systems and processes. And the main advantage, as Tim had pointed out, is that by the creation of these immutable records, we can really have a detailed provenance in terms of how the data is moved and being tracked. Next slide, please. So just a few points for orientation. The blockchain is a ledger. It's simply a place to record information. So in some respects, you can think of it as a database. We use digital keys to control that information, to see who can see what data, so that not all participants would have equal access. It is a decentralized network so that every person in the network has an instance of the blockchain on it. This has some advantages from preventing of hacking because it's much more difficult to hack 1,000 copies of a database to insert, let's say, a fake serial number than it is to go to a centralized database. And there are tools such as smart contracts, which are executable pieces of code that can make certain processes happen. So, for example, when a wholesaler receives a medication, if everything's within the specification in terms of temperature and storage and transportation, then payment could be executed back to the manufacturer that the product was received. Next, please. So a lot of people think of the blockchain as new technology, but it's really old technology. Cryptography and private keys, which are the foundation of the blockchain, actually go back to the 1940s and the 1970s. Blockchain itself has been out for at least 8 years, and so there's been a lot of experience from the public blockchain perspective, and now within the last 3 years, we're starting to look at advances such as smart contracts. Next slide, please, Maria. So when we're thinking about this from a holistic perspective, it's really about interconnecting everyone, as Tim had mentioned. So regardless if you're looking at it for a clinical trial to bring in your CMO, to connect your wholesalers, we now have an opportunity with serialization to interconnect partners in a much tighter way than we could in the past, because there was really no way to track that individual bottle down. And this has a lot of advantages for potential recalls and things along that line. Next, please. So when we think about applications of the supply chain, we're really looking at it from interconnecting the API supplier all the way through to the end of the market. So as you can see in this graphic, as each as the drug is passing through each individual phase, then an individual block is being created. So if we look at A101, for example, and we follow it through to where it's ready to go out to the market, then you can see the provenance back. So E501 is the block that was created when it was ready to go to the market with its serial number, lot number, NC, etc. And you can track the provenance back to when the ingredient actually entered the supply chain. So we have a much more closed loop in terms of where everything is at. Next slide, please. And then as we progress further, if we look at E501, we can then see how it progresses all the way down to the patient level. So if there were to be a drug recall, for example, instead of doing now, which is more of a shotgun approach where everybody is notified, but then the pharmacy has no idea which patients got which drug, we can now track it down to the patient level and have much more targeted recalls, which would save time and money. Next, please. So when we look at the overall drug supply chain, especially if we talk about counterfeiting, now counterfeit drugs or fake drugs will most generally enter at the wholesaler or the pharmacy level. And even in countries where there's going to be a centralized database, we can leverage the concept of this provenance and consensus to help prevent that from entering the supply chain. So when a pharmacy put a fake serialized drug into the supply chain, then when they went to do the billing, there would be rejection that this serial number is not legitimate because both the manufacturer and wholesaler would say, no, this is not a legitimate number. And even in other countries, as Tim mentioned, in Europe, where they're looking at having a centralized database, this could still be important because as you saw in his numbers, this is the billions and billions of dollars in a criminal enterprise. And most hacks will occur internally, so it's not hard to believe that criminal element will either put pressure on a government official with access to this database, or will pay them a large sum of money to insert fake serial numbers. So even if that would occur at that level and the pharmacy can then validate against that, it could still get a rejection at the manufacturer level if those numbers were not correct. Next, please. So really, when we look at this, it's really about creating a trusted network. Blockchain facilitates connections and makes them much tighter than they were in the past. Mutability allows for better regulatory compliance. To understand, we get this validation from everyone, we control the data, and by creating a decentralized network, we make it much harder for people to introduce counterfeit drugs into the marketplace. Next, please. And for those more technically oriented, if you want to see what a blockchain stack might look like, on the left side, it's kind of more technical components, the intermediate level where device registration occurs, API gateway, a collector, historical data, and on the right side, we're kind of looking at what are the outputs from that stack would be analytics and reporting, data and applications, first peer-to-peer protocols, and the distributed ledger itself. And that's it, Maria. Thank you.
Presentation. Daryl, that was great. I thank you for a technical presentation, which gives a really good balance between what Tim was talking about from a global industry issue, and now you're getting, and you got to what the technology can do. So not surprising, you got a lot of great questions. And so one question that we got here for you, Daryl, is which consensus mechanism is leveraged in ADLT?
So from a consensus standpoint, there's two consensus mechanisms. The public blockchain uses miners to achieve consensus. What we believe is a proper framework for blockchain technology is using cryptographic proofs that the computers would actually generate. So there'd be no people involved. The computer would say, yes, this is valid, or no, this isn't valid.
Oh, excellent. So one more question before we get to Mark's presentation is, are you working with any particular APIs for the software to access the blockchain?
No, we're not working with a specific. Our approach is looking at a very general and high level. So whatever is appropriate for a particular customer is what we think would be the best in terms of both the blockchain solution and what APIs might be required to integrate the different systems and components.
Okay, great. So thank you, Daryl. Everybody, please keep sending your questions. At the close of Mark's presentation, which is our last presentation, we will try to get through all these questions, but I think it's really great that you are opening the discussion for everyone. So next, I would like to introduce Mark Paxton, the CEO of RX360. Mark?
Hi, everybody. I hope you hear me. It looks like I'm unmuted here. I'd like to first off thank Tim and Daryl for their wonderful presentations. So I just wanted to, I was asked to talk a little bit about some additional applications of blockchain. But before I start in my presentation here, just as I've listened to both Daryl and Tim, a couple of thoughts. So, from a global standpoint, I've been doing global regulatory for quite some time, and track and trace and serialization matters. I used to work with FP on some of their things. I worked with Pharma and what is now the Pharmaceutical Distribution or Distributor Security Alliance on a number of different things. Many of those efforts tend to be very localized and domestic in terms of their outcomes and what their intent is. Companies, multinational companies, pharmaceutical companies in particular, who are struggling with these issues across the entire globe are not looking at it that way. They much prefer a more harmonized way of accomplishing supply chain security, including the utilization of track and trace and serialization. And what I think is very valuable and a value add is blockchain. From my perspective, as I've gotten to know more about blockchain, not just with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act in the United States, but also with the Falsified Medicines Directive in Europe, some of the activities going on in China and elsewhere, I look at the blockchain data and ledger as being a way of communicating amongst trading partners the information that's required to be forwarded to your trading partner in a secure environment and necessarily is already interoperable, which is one of the key things that we're, as manufacturers, have been concerned with, is ensuring a secure, interoperable environment. And from my personal perspective, I don't think it matters whether it's distributed or centralized or not. Those are the two things. We need to be able to really identify the authenticity of the data that's accompanying the movement of those products. And just to simplify from, and level set everybody, how you tie this data directly into the movement, the physical movement of a product, is simply the 2D barcode that's required on the which represents the serialized G10 and is required under the Drug Supply Chain Security Act in the U.S. That's the mechanism by which you can ensure that data is linked directly to physical movement of products. So with that said, I'm just going to talk about some additional examples that I think the pharma community still struggles with. So I'm going to talk real briefly about DSCSA. In fact, very briefly, because I assume that most of the people on this call have been participating in the Center for Supply Chain Studies on Fridays with Bob Celeste on the utilization of blockchain in the DSCSA environment. But a couple of other places I think are really important are certificates of analysis, certificates of pharmaceutical products, and customs data. In each case, we have to be thinking about data integrity problems, and I know that not everybody's going to be familiar with what I mean by that. So I'm going to start off with that on the next slide, please. So when we talk about data integrity in manufacturing, we have an acronym, ALCOA. And when we say ALCOA to a data integrity issue, don't think of this exclusively as computerized data. This ALCOA applies whether you're printing something by hand or any other way in which, drawing a picture, doesn't matter, however you are creating information. When you talk about violations to data integrity, there is always a predicate underlying good manufacturing practice rule that yields a data integrity issue. So data integrity by itself is meaningless unless there's a predicate rule. And those things are specified in 21 CFR Parts 210 and 11 in the Code of Federal Regulations, but I won't go into that. But what this means is that when you create information that's used in the pharma manufacturing environment, the information must be attributable to somebody, it must be legible, it must be readable, it must be contemporaneous. You don't create data today and come back and say that I've attributed to Mark Paxton 3 days from now. It must be original and it must be accurate. These are the things that we look at for assuring that the data is credible. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm not going to talk much about DSCSA because I think probably most of you are very familiar with it. But we need, applying those principles, those ALCOA principles to data supporting the movement of products in downstream from manufacturers under DSCSA. Manufacturers have to initiate with a transaction, or a transaction statement, followed up by transaction information and history that must be moved along from trading partner to trading partner, starting in November of this year for manufacturers with creating the transaction statement, and then iterations of implementation between now and 2023 all the way down to pharmacy. But again, I look at blockchain as a way of ensuring interoperability between trading partners and tying that interoperable data, which is the TITSTH information, back to that product, physical movement of that product, utilizing that 2D barcode and that unique serialized G10 on that product. Next slide, please. But some other places where we struggle to verify and authenticate information that typically comes in via paper right now, but we recognize in industry needs to be modified and looked at. And it's something the regulatory authorities are also very interested in. So I think movement, although this may be getting ahead of the curve a bit from the regulatory side, I think the movement is this way. So one of the things, if you're not familiar with manufacturing, finished product manufacturing, whenever I bring in material to put into my finished dosage form, whether it's excipients, active pharmaceutical ingredients, packaging materials, etc., they come into my facility. I quarantine them until I do release testing, and when I do the release testing, I compare the specifications of the sent to me through a certificate of analysis that is provided to me by the manufacturer of the material that I'm using. Sometimes these specifications are set by the manufacturer. You'll see this in branded products, the finished dosage form manufacturer. Sometimes you'll see this especially when it's a branded product. But generally speaking, many of these materials, especially in the excipient space, are set, they're kind of off the shelf, and you design your drug formulation, your finished product formulation around those specifications. But at the end of the day, what's important is that these specifications not vary. And again, when I get that certificate analysis, sometimes, especially if I'm buying material from 3 different distributors in Asia Pac, I don't have any control over not only the material, but also the certificate of analysis that make accompany that material, and neither does the manufacturer, the original manufacturer of that material. So how do we verify and validate or authenticate whether or not the certificate of analysis is relevant to what I'm trying to do, other than, it's perfectly great that, the specifications are met, but if this thing has been contaminated or cross-contaminated in holding or storage, through, in a peanut manufacturing facility or processing plant, I haven't done myself any good. So having authenticatable data around the certificate of analysis and making sure that it meets all the Alcoa requirements is an important component in GMP that I think blockchain would have a significant use. Next slide, please. And another area is the issuance in a similar fashion, the issuance of certificates of pharmaceutical product. This is a import-export regime model that was set up, or scheme, I guess, that was set up by the World Health Organization, recognizing that many countries, especially low and middle-income countries, don't have any manufacturing capabilities at all. They have very limited resources for regulatory authorities to make a determination about allowing an offered product to actually come in as a legitimate product into their marketplace. What they set out to do with the certificate of pharmaceutical product is create an export product certificate from an exporting country, wherein which the certificate that is issued by the national regulatory authority is verifying to the importing authority that the product that is being exported and offered for import in their country is manufactured under GMP in the exporting country and is also a legitimate product in that exporting country's marketplace. This is a very important thing. This has gone from a simple export certification scheme to the fact that now many regulatory authorities across the globe who still don't have real robust review systems will require, as part of the registration process for marketing approval, that certificates of pharmaceutical product are issued as well as part of the registration package. So again, with the CTP, there is no real way to authenticate it. In the United States and at FDA, I can tell you the process previously was the US FDA would sign it, we would send it to the State Department would authenticate it, that's saying that it was coming from the US FDA. They would forward it to the forward it to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with an embassy located down the street, if you will, and then that would be forwarded to the Importing Regulatory Authority. That does not occur anymore. The time mechanism for making that happen was just too long. So ultimately now we have a CTP that's issued by FDA. We give it to the manufacturer. The manufacturer has to deal with the issues when they arrive in the importing country's world. That is a significant issue for the importing country because, again, the legitimacy of a CPP is at issue. And I personally, I think this scheme that was introduced would, if every country actually adopted it, if every member state to the WHO actually adopted it, it would actually resolve many, many issues. It's not utilized significantly enough in my view, but if it were, it would be a great tool. But in order to make it work that way, we need to be able to make this authenticatable and contemporaneous with the shipment. And I think blockchain would be a mechanism, a very good mechanism by which the transmission of the actual certificate and who generated it and who reviewed it, who received it, and who pushed it forward would be captured in a secure environment. Next slide, please. Then lastly, there is a program in place since 2001 in the United States. It's called the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. The primary goal of the CTPAT program is to help improve the security of all global supply chains when they impact the United States, i.e. if product is coming in or going out. It's an interesting program. I'm going to talk real quickly about it. But there are many mutual recognition agreements in place with a number of other foreign custom agencies, Canada, many of the Asia-Pac countries, things of that nature, in which they're doing the exact same thing. In our import-export world in which we operate today, and this is, again, one of the reasons why we tend to look at things as manufacturers on a global basis, is, you offer a product, you make a declaration of import, and you put it in front of customs in the United States. They verify that you paid your duty, that you've done everything that you're supposed to do. Then what they do is they take that information, that declaration, and they provide that information to the relevant regulatory authority. So if it's a basic chemical, for instance, it may go to the Environmental Protection Agency for compliance determination. If it's a food, drug, or cosmetic or any related material, it's going to go to the FDA. And FDA will look at the documentation and either make it, and either one of two things, or one of three things. They'll say, we do not allow it in, we do allow it in, or we're going to hold it for sampling, routine sampling, just to make sure that various actors are doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's all changed somewhat with electronic forms that are being submitted through what we call a single window system now. This is the single window system is a harmonized system that is developed through the World Customs Organization. In the United States, we have the International Trade Data System. That's our single window. We take that information, so that all these import declaration, all your payment forms, etc., all your freight forwarding companies would manage for you. They input all this information through the ITDS. Customs looks at it electronically. They take that ITDS information and they push it out to the FDA utilizing the Automated Commercial Environment System. And again, what this does in that environment is handle electronic data that needs to be validated and authenticated, especially if you're an applicant for the CTPAT program. And why I say that is because as follows. In order to become a CTPAT partner, you have to submit an application. You have to be certified by the United States Customs and Bureau CBP. And if you do that, if you go through that process, you will find that there are substantial benefits associated with it. And that is you'll have increased security around your materials that you're bringing into the United States. You'll have increased certainty about the acceptance for the offer of import. and you will have less routine inspection holds, and you'll overall find that system more efficient. I can tell you from my own personal experience with working with Customs and ITDS and ACE that those folks are not aware of blockchain, but at the end of the day, the whole application process to become a partner is about being able to show Customs that you have a routine process in place that secures your supply chain such that you know that this material is in fact coming from a specific manufacturer in the origin of this particular country. And as long as you can show that, you can get certified. And one way, again, you know, we have to still be able to tie the physical movement of the product to the electronic chain. That I think, again, once again, I think blockchain would play a very invaluable role because of what it does for, you know, how it enables interoperability, which is something that if you're just simply working on a track and trace system right now, interoperability is the key issue, right? So I think that's about it for me. Next slide. Questions?
Okay. So, Mark, thank you for a great presentation. It was really, really good, and I think it gives a nice overview of, you know, what the pharma professionals are dealing with right now. One of the questions we got is, how would you say an ISO 13485 certification, which is good manufacturing process, would be influenced by blockchain?
Well, you know, I don't know that it would be, honestly, because I say this as follows. It may only in the same sense that from a GMP standpoint, which is consistent with ISO, in the movement of product from one manufacturing site to another manufacturing site. But I can tell you, at least with respect to GMPs as they're applied in the United States and Europe, there are some things that we do on the GMP side that are in excess of ISO, and that is a lot of the validation documentation that we do and the qualification requirements for instrumentation and manufacturing equipment and things of that nature. But that said, in our manufacturing environment, because of computerized systems that are in place, laboratory information management systems and things of that nature, manufacturers are already in an internal closed network, are already beholden to these principles behind Alcoa. And in fact, if you look at some of the warning letters that come from FDA or statements of noncompliance from Europe, you will find that the data integrity issues really are addressing the specific failures of applying that Alcoa acronym to that computer-generated data that exists already in those manufacturing facilities. But again, if you're doing your job right in those manufacturing facilities, that data is already Alcoa. If you're doing it right, it's Alcoa. It's digital, it's encrypted. We know exactly who touched what data whenever because there's an audit trail tied to a digital signature. So I don't think that component is. It's only really the exchange of information that, from my perspective, I think, and now sometimes you want that, and sometimes you would have that from manufacturing site to manufacturing site, but and maybe that's an appropriate role for blockchain. But for me, from my perspective, the true value here is when you're trying to develop an interoperable schema.
Thank you. So we're continuing to compile quite a bit of, we've gotten a lot of great questions and we're compiling them. And as we're doing that, I just want to bring to everybody's attention, as Tim mentioned earlier, that we are hosting actually a full-day forum on June 6th at Johns Hopkins University in Rockville, Maryland, which is going to look at additional blockchain applications on the pharmaceutical supply chain. So today we were talking about security, but we have a lot of discussions on the concept of optimization and inventory management, hopefully driving revenue, not to look at blockchain just as an expense, but as a potential revenue. And obviously the ultimate goal is to have blockchain even increase or enhance the patient experience. So I just hope all of you, if you have that day available, if you need more information, just go to the website and hopefully you can join us. So back to the questions we have here. I think this question might be for Daryl. What is being done to overcome the transaction throughput limitations of blockchain?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of work being done in that area. So now I've talked to some blockchain providers, and now they're up to like 10,000 transactions per second being put in. You have to keep in mind that some of the limitations of, let's say, the Bitcoin blockchain are related to the fact that there's miners involved. When it's more of a computerized process and there's no miners, the transactions can be put on in a lot quicker basis. There's also work being done to expand the amount of data that can be stored and how the pointers can be constructed to go back to information in different parts of a trusted partner's host ERP system.
Okay, thank you. Tim, I think we have a question for you. It says, when using disparate end-user devices to verify the drugs, how can the system authenticate that a specific drug has been checked or consumed from geographical area? For example, in developing countries where users don't have access to smartphones.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that gets into the issue of, so a blockchain, what we could envision it could do is to really act as a central repository, or not a central repository, but a decentralized repository for a lot of metadata that comes in from different devices. So mPedigree is an example where if you scan the barcode and you're able to, basically collect serialization information, or even something more robust like a QDR code or something like that that has more information packets in it, then it could it could essentially, plug into, a blockchain, and then that information, at least from the standpoint of where it came from, which user provided the information, and even geographic metadata, could be entered in an immutable way. So instead of having that information being susceptible to any type of change, or also, to, just having the information being inputted incorrectly, those type of things, you would have the ability to ensure that that information is correct. And then from a large group of metadata, then what you can really do is start to do, use machine learning and all types of predictive analytics to figure out where the gaps are in the supply chain. So geographically, you can geocode that data for phones, of course, and for devices that have that ability. For feature phones, you probably wouldn't be able to do that, but you would still potentially have some information that relates to the geography. And if you're seeing enough of those serialization numbers that are coming out false or incorrect through an mPedigree system, and they're clustering in a locality, then you can do, standard geospatial analysis to figure out why those clusters are happening, and if there's any other aspects of the supply chain that are creating that that penetration of fake medicine. So there's a lot of opportunities there. I hope that kind of answered the question. I mean, blockchain is going to be, from a surveillance perspective, dependent upon the robustness of the technology that feeds in that data or metadata. But, you have data that's going to be more trustworthy and, again, going to be immutable, and it's going to be built upon each other instead of just discrete data points.
Great, thanks. So, Mark, given your experience with definitely many different regulatory agencies, definitely both in the U.S. and abroad, I guess more I would like to maybe hear your assessment with regards to what do you think compliance-wise, like what are the challenges potentially that we could face in the area of compliance when we look at employing a blockchain application? Like, would the FDA be like, this is great, or FDA be like, whoa, there's some issues we have to take into consideration? What would be your assessment there?
So think about it this way, and I'm just going to use BioPharma as an example. I mean, if you're engaged in manufacturing and packaging, you understand the concepts of validation, and manufacturers who are retrofitting packaging lines as opposed to putting new ones in there that are already outfitted with serialization capabilities, high-speed, high-resolution cameras and things of that nature, you'll find an error rate, right? And the agency doesn't like error rates, right? So, you will have some issue, some specification, but consider this. Let's say, just by way of example, I internally have validated my packaging line, and I have aggregated onto pallet with appropriate parent-child relationships, serial numbers that cover 1 through 100 products, right? And I didn't, you know, I mean, I've confirmed them myself, but now I have this data set residing somewhere, and I push it out to some wholesaler that I have. You know, they're a small wholesaler. They move some of my product, right? And I don't know, you know, I didn't go in there and check their systems, and I don't know what their systems look like. But let's say that they have a 30% error rate all of a sudden in terms of the data, because the way they format, with their expectation on incoming data, the way it's formatted, the metadata around it, whatever the case may be, is not consistent with the way you push that data out, right? When that happens, they're obligated to quarantine that product, right? And whenever that happens, now you've got an alert to the agency. The agency is going to come out, and the very first question the agency is going to ask, what an investigator is going to ask, well, let me see how you validated your process, right? So I think with blockchain, what you have here is an ability to make sure that you have, again, you know, this interoperability challenge that exists out there, but at the end of the day, it authenticates the product, and so you could more easily go into that facility and say, look, I can go back now because of blockchain and go back to the manufacturer who issued that transaction statement, that initial one, and I can go back and look at them real quickly and verify that this carton of 100 products, whether it's on pallets or not, is perfectly fine for distribution into the marketplace. It's an internal issue with the wholesaler itself, but that's how I see that kind of a compliance issue coming about.
Great, excellent. So I know a few of you have asked me if I can make the slides available. I ask you just to send me an email at m.palmandini@ieee.org. I'm going to check with the presenters if we can email you the PDF of the slides. If you have any questions about the Pharma Forum coming up on the 6th of June, you can email me there as well. And I just want to remind everybody, if you're interested in writing a letter to the community of blockchain developers about any concerns and questions, or what you need to know about employing blockchain into your pharmaceutical enterprise, please do participate and submit your question. It's anonymous. And I think we're definitely a little bit past the 45-minute mark. I think this was an exciting conversation. I want to thank our presenters. I think they gave an outstanding overview, and I hope all of you enjoyed it. And we will be doing more of these type of webinars in the future, and I'll be sure that you all get an invitation to join us. So I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.